Take the scenic route as we explore the mysterious and whimsical next. Over the past 20 years as a garden designer, I've enjoyed helping homeowners create private sanctuaries full of beauty and wonder. I find each garden to be a fresh opportunity to explore ways to create uniquely personal spaces. These are just a few of the gardens I've helped to transform into garden homes. Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Welcome to the Garden Home, where you'll find practical ideas, beautiful landscapes, and much, much more to help inspire you to push the boundaries of your home right out into the garden, to the edges of your property. Now, in today's show, we're going to slow down and take the scenic route through our gardens and have a look at this element or principle of design called time. We'll also see how time can lead us to fun or whimsy in the garden, and even to mystery. You see, time, whimsy, and mystery are just 3 of the 12 principles of design that I rely on when I create a garden home. Now, what I mean by garden home is simply the approach that I take when designing a garden to make the garden an extension of the home, thereby extending your living spaces outside and allowing us to bring the bounty of nature inside. I break a garden home down into a series of smaller gardens that I call garden rooms. You know, no matter the season, there's so many opportunities for us to bring the garden indoors. You see, this is also a part of the garden home concept. What works outdoors can work indoors. What I'm doing today, and we'll be developing this idea throughout the show, is creating an indoor garden, if you will, using some beautiful long-blooming houseplants, like this white cyclamen and these dendrobium orchids. You see, they speak to this idea of time in that these flowers will last up to 3 months in the house. Now let's get back to the garden and explore this idea of time a little more. You see, I believe that the winter is the best time to look at the layout or the bones or framework of the garden. You see, the foundation is very clear this time of year. You can see how the shrubs and trees all play into the design. If a garden is well designed for winter, it'll certainly hang together during the growing season. Over the years, I've learned that the best design gardens, whether they're expansive tracts of land, a flower bed, or even a container on your patio, all benefit from some thoughtful planning. Having a plan to follow can save you time, money, and energy when you go to the nursery, as well as help make your garden more beautiful. It's best to plan ahead and prepare for your visits to the garden center and nursery before the spring rush. One way to do this is to follow that old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. A few snapshots will go a long way in describing your particular situation. A plot plan of your property can also be very helpful to the professional assisting you. These plans can be done by a surveyor, or you can even prepare one yourself. Accurate measurements are the key. Another suggestion you might consider is to make lists of plants that you like and take photographs of some of your favorite gardens. These can help you describe and illustrate your tastes and preferences, and you'll find that keeping this information in a file will help you when you have the urge to plant. Garden centers and nurseries are full of well-trained professionals, so remember, if you're prepared, they can help you make the best choices. Time isn't just about the seasons ahead, it's also about garden fashion. As we dress, paint, and refurbish ourselves right into the next style, we find that passé fashions are so often linked forever to the years that they were popular. Take objects like gold-colored appliances, shag carpeting, and leisure suits. When I think of those, I think as much about a point in time or history as I do the objects themselves. While we may not be as fickle about plants and garden features as we are about our clothes and cars and home decorating, similar preferences about what's in and out have existed throughout history in horticulture and garden design. You see, formal gardens were all the rage throughout the 17th century, largely because of the influences of the Palace of Versailles in France. That trend was replaced by a preference for a more natural approach in design by the mid-18th century because of work being done in England. Sweeping pastoral landscapes accented with clumps of trees and lakes were transformed from the highly stylized, orderly patterns of the former age. Fashion also plays a role in the plant world. You see, sometimes we find that the latest Johnny-come-lately is all the rage, pushing aside old standbys even though they've been reliable in the garden for years. But you know, the flip side of this, the positive side of these new plant introductions, is that so often they show better disease resistance and more bloom, so they're better for our gardens. Economics also plays a role in a plant's popularity. Take, for instance, these beautiful orchids. Why, 100 years ago, if you tried to buy one of these, the cost would be through the roof. But today, because of modern breeding programs and production facilities, orchids, well, they can be enjoyed by all of us. They're really not that expensive. These dendrobium orchids are so beautiful. I'm going to use them as the centerpiece for this little garden I'm going to use inside the house. Now, when I create a garden like this, I assemble the plants, and I don't literally plant them in the container. I like to keep them in their individual containers, and this allows me to satisfy their watering needs individually rather than having to water the entire garden. Now, when you create one of these, you can dress it up or dress it down. I'm using this glazed ceramic dish for this composition, but you know, if you want to play it down, baskets are wonderful, and I've even put one together over here in this Chinese or Oriental foot bath. Now, if you decide to create one of these little gardens, there are a few things I recommend. One is to get a container that doesn't have a drainage hole in the bottom. You can see this one doesn't have one. If it does, you'll want to block it. And if you plant in one of these baskets, just line it with a plastic bag. Another tip that'll come in handy is this one. Over the years, I've discovered that floral foam works really well to elevate the plants. If you're like me, it's always difficult to find plants that fit exactly in the container. So by using the floral foam, you can cut it down and customize the fit. Now, the other great thing about having this in the bottom of the container is that any water that spills over the top or through the plant is absorbed by the floral foam. Now, let's get back to this idea of plant trends. You know, the old-fashioned hollyhock has been around for a long time, but it's made a comeback in gardens. And why shouldn't it? Because it's so easy to grow and so beautiful. Hollyhocks were almost extinct from the American garden scene until a few years ago. Time seems to have forgotten a plant that was so beloved by our great-grandparents. But like most things in life, the hollyhock has come full circle and is finding homes in fashionable gardens across the country. I like to look at many of these old-fashioned plants as living antiques. Even annuals, there's a great example. They've become even more popular because they have been improved upon. They're better than they were in the past. Take, for instance, coleus, nicotiana, petunias, and even geraniums. As a kid, I remember growing coleus from seed. It seems like they sprouted overnight and rewarded me with color all summer long. Today I buy coleus for my garden already started, and I'm happy to report that the range and colors are even more vibrant today than they were 10 or 15 years ago. Take a look at this one called tilt-a-whirl. Nicotiana, or flowering tobacco, is a plant I've been growing for years and with great results. In the past few years, during my travels, I've seen nicotiana growing everywhere, from grand estates like this one called Langsdorffii at Chumley Castle to simple cottage gardens. Here's a variety called Saratoga lime that's very popular because of these chartreuse green flowers. Geraniums have never really gone out of fashion, but the improvements to them are really spectacular. Long have red geraniums been an old standby on front porches and small pots, but today they're used in a variety of ways, and the color range is really quite incredible. Now, for true old-fashioned summer garden color, you just can't beat petunias. Last summer, I couldn't get enough of them, especially cascading out of containers. In beds, I enjoyed a series called Storm because the petals are quick to recover after a rainstorm. Can you imagine all of that color captured in a single container? Well, when you put containers together, I think you should have fun. Mix it up a little bit. Last year, I created one using two of these elements, petunias and geraniums. To put this container together, you use a hosta as your centerpiece, or as I like to call it, you use a tall and spiky element. Next, you fill in with something round and full. Here I've used two types of geraniums, one called Lila Compact Cascade, along with a larger blooming Casanova geranium. I've used the Casanova geranium here over to the side as an accent or companion container to this larger composition. Now, spilling out of the main container is Helichrysum dwarf silver, and to really add a splash of color, I've used the cascading petunia Ramblin' Neon Rose. And to really make the composition look full and robust, I've echoed the petunia in this accent container to the side. What a great way to take advantage of some old favorites in a new way. As you can see, I just about have this little interior garden finished. And like the container we just saw, many of the same elements are present. We have something tall and spiky. Here in the middle, something round and full in the way of the cyclamen and these wonderful ferns. And then to cascade, I have the ivy. Now, you know, this idea of something old is new again doesn't always apply to plants. It also applies to garden ornament. It comes and goes in popularity as well. All of the rage today might be ironwork in the garden or brightly colored garden furniture. The point is, you want to place objects in your garden that make you happy, that mean something to you, something you connect to. You don't need to put things in there just because they're fashionable. What I like to do is try to create a mood with garden ornament. If I'm trying to create a harmonious, easygoing sort of mood, the objects in the garden reflect that. They have a nice patina on them. They show some age and wear. On the other hand, if I want to create a garden that has a mood that's more energetic, then I might use materials that are more contrasting. You might choose objects that are in contrast to the foliage or the path material in a garden, such as bright colored glazed jars as one example. A garden, by its very nature, projects a certain sense of timelessness. I suppose it's because of the cycles of birth and decay that are constantly going on. Another aspect of the garden that I think brings great charm to it is this idea of constant change. Gardens are indeed dynamic. They're moving, they're changing all the time. And I think that the garden ornament in a garden should reflect that as well. So I don't mind a little peeling paint, a nice sort of mossy patina on things. I think it makes it fit the garden much better. You know, for me, the architecture should really lead a garden's design. For example, in my own cottage garden, my house was built at the turn of the century. I've added plants that were introduced about the same time as the house, particularly old-fashioned roses. I grow a selection of roses that range in date from 1830 to 1930. They include Lamarck, which I grow over my tool shed, and Frau Karl Druski, which adorns the arbors that go into the fountain garden. And then there's Iceberg, the Fairy, and Madame Plantier. The architecture of my home is further enhanced with a picket fence and borders that reflect a cottage garden feel. And I've echoed the columns on the front porch and arbors leading into and out of my fountain garden. For my garden, you saw how I used the style and time period of the house to create a garden that was complementary to the architecture. Now, here's a much grander example. This is Old Westbury in Old Westbury, New York. Now, the original creators of this beautiful estate were all about trying to create a certain look that reflected a period of time. And they wanted to, well, evoke the feeling of a place they both loved, England. Well, the house is a look back, it seems to me. The architecture is much older than the house.
Exactly. It was built around the turn of the 20th century and completed in 1906. However, the style of it goes back to the middle 1600s. And this is in the style of Christopher Wren and his
Charles
school.
II. Well, the gardens are so incredible here. It's just one experience after another. You have this beautiful pastoral landscape, and then when you get into the gardens themselves, one garden leads you into the next, just as you find in English gardens.
Exactly, and it's sort of that room going from one room to the next. Some of the gardens are very similar to the estate in which Margarita Grace lived.
So Mrs. Phipps, I guess maiden name Grace, she came from one of these grand estates.
Right. They didn't live there for very long, but when she was married, her family was living in Battle Abbey, which is on the site of the Battle of Hastings. And she brought a love of English gardens, and particularly a love of that garden here. The rose garden is, the formal rose garden, in fact, is designed after one on the property at Battle Abbey.
Really?
Yes, and so is the yew walk, which we have done in Hemlock.
Yes.
And I'm guessing, this is my own opinion, that it was probably done in Hemlock rather than yew, because at the time the family moved in, she had a baby in arms and two very small little boys, and wanted the effect of the ghost walk that she knew in
Yes.
Battle Abbey.
Right, and
very
hemlock
quickly.
could be acquired
quick
in much
grower.
larger plants, and
Yes.
they grow faster as well.
Exactly. So she got the effect much more rapidly.
This estate is about a lot more than just elegance and grandeur. You see, this was a family home for the Phipps, and they enjoyed it, and you can see elements of humor throughout. A touch of whimsy was important. You see, they had 4 children. They had all boys and 1 little girl, and when that little girl reached 10 years of age, she was presented with this little cottage. Just look at the authentic thatching for the roof, and these massive timbers and stucco that make up the walls. It was a fun place to play on rainy days. Now the garden encouraged children to explore. The plants like lamb's ear, fragrant herbs, and exuberant sparkler-like cleome, or cat's whiskers as they're often called, stimulated their imagination. And the tiny fairy roses, morning glories, and zinnias along the picket fence added so much magic. It's really charming, isn't it? Well, you know, the Phipps were so concerned that the little boys would be jealous of what they had done for the little girl that they built 3 log cabins for them. Well, you can see who got the better end of the deal. You may be wondering how the element whimsy fits into this idea about the design element time. Well, I think that certainly this example of an English cottage garden on a grand English estate certainly fits. It's appropriate to the period of the estate and to the house and so forth. And while children don't necessarily have to have something as elaborate as this to play in, having a space where they can go and play out their fantasies and play make-believe, where time stands still, is very important. In order to explore this idea of mystery a bit further, I wanted to bring you to this place. It's a garden that I helped to create several years ago. It's a special place to me because here I was allowed to use the principle of mystery in a bold way. So why don't you come into the garden and let me show you around. This garden is made up of a few simple elements. In fact, I think the simplicity of this design actually enhances the mystery. Now, the elements I used here are a series of tall vertical boulders along with a few plants, just some ferns, moss, and hosta. Perfect additions to a shade garden. I wanted a bold feature in the garden, but one that at the same time was harmonious with the woodland landscape beyond and the contemporary architecture of the home. And these stones serve that purpose. It was really quite a feat to get them in here. You see, each one of these weighs close to a ton. Not only do these stones evoke a certain sense of mystery, but also a sense of great age. They actually came out of an ancient dry riverbed. You can see the moss and lichens on them just add to the whole ambience. What I really like about this arrangement of stones is that they serve as a focal point from the house to the garden. So from your perspective, these stones arrest your attention as a visitor walking up to the front door. The other aspect of this arrangement of stones that I find so appealing is the fact that it creates a certain rhythm in this space. One stone placed after another creates a certain cadence. Now, it's important to realize when creating rhythm in a space that the negative space between the objects is as important as the objects themselves. Now, there's one other aspect of this garden I want to point out. It's the idea of the crescent or the curve and how that can create a sense of mystery. You see, when we laid out this terrace, we laid it out on a slight curve like this, and then placed the stones in a similar fashion following that same line, placing a path here between the terrace and the stones. Now what this does is it doesn't allow you to see what's beyond on the other side, further enhancing the sense of mystery in this garden. So as we've seen, a few bold elements can produce dramatic results. Now Now here's another example in my garden of how a curved path can create a sense of mystery. It's a simple device. You see, this curved path starts at the breezeway and works itself all the way down to this cypress arch behind me. And as you walk along the path, you can't see the final destination. So this is how the mystery is set up. You're intrigued by what lies beyond. Now another thing that I've done here that helps establish the sense of mystery is I've strategically placed some shrubs so I can't see the path or the final destination. The rhododendron, which blooms so beautifully in the spring, serves as an evergreen anchor and screens that path in this shade garden. Now carrying on with this notion about using a shrub or some object to conceal a view to heighten mystery, I created this cypress or clipped arch behind me. Now it was really a simple process, although it did require some time. Let's take a look at what went into creating this. In the very beginning, I chose a fast-growing hedge, and once it had matured to say 6 or 7 feet, I designed a frame of an arch on paper and took it to a local welder. And in no time, after bending some metal and lots of sparks, they were able to assemble the frame and bring my plan to life. Next, I painted it with a rust-resistant enamel. This will preserve the frame and keep the rust from getting on anyone who passes through. To secure the frame in place, I used some pre-mixed bagged concrete. I mixed enough to go around each of the 4 legs, which was about 2 bags. For the next growing season, I let the 2 plants on each side of the arch grow taller so I could take their tops and fold them over the arch. I tethered the longest central limbs of these plants to the frame using some old leather straps. Now anything will do, you just want to make sure that it doesn't cut through the trunks of the hedge. Now I chose Leyland cypress because it's an evergreen. It's fast growing and it shears beautifully. Now there's a wide range of evergreens I could have used. Now it was important to me to use an evergreen plant over a deciduous plant because I wanted this to hold up and be a strong presence even in the winter in this part of my garden. Today we've been exploring this idea of time and how mystery and whimsy play into it. You know, one of the things that I'm always trying to do when I create a garden is to come up with devices that make people want to slow down and just enjoy the garden as they walk through it and experience it, see it in a different way. One way to do this is to simply place the stepping stones in a certain way. To achieve this, I always try to find room for plants, such as ground covers, to fill in between the stones. Plants like creeping jenny, vinca, ajuga. Herbs like thyme look great and smell even better when they're sandwiched between stones on a path. Ferns and climbing roses can take over a space in a growing season, giving your garden an aged look. And then there, of course, are mosses. For many of us who enjoy gardening, it's both the process of growing things and the end result that keep us motivated. We all want things to have that full-grown and mature look immediately. For instance, I planted this rose about 5 years ago, and I could hardly wait for it to grow and cover this end of the building. Not only do I desire to have the plants in my garden look established, I also like for the same to be true of my containers and walkways. Any paving material that has a nice patina of age seems to fit in so much better into the landscape for me. Often the new materials, such as this, just stand out too much. But of course, over time, this will be taken care of by the colonization of mosses, lichens, and algae. They'll knock off the brassy newness of it. One way to accelerate this process is to create a mixture that will help moss to colonize more rapidly by following a simple recipe. Start by using 1 part moss. You can collect it by scraping it off the top of the ground, and you'll have better luck finding it on the north side of buildings. Combine this with 3 parts beer and 1 part granular sugar in a blender. Now after you've pureed the ingredients, pour the mixture over stones, bare soil, or on containers to get the moss started. In today's show, we've seen how time and mystery and whimsy all work together to create an overall effect in the garden. I hope you go away with some ideas that you can apply to your own garden as you create the garden home of your dreams. From the Garden Home, I'm Alan Smith. More information about today's topic and other topics covered in this series can be found at pallansmith.com.
On an upcoming episode of P. Alan Smith's Garden Home.
This is Alan Smith. A hallmark of grand gardens is their skillful integration of structures that blend the overall design of home and garden seamlessly. Learn how to use structures to enhance your garden home with a tour of my garden and a list of structures most commonly found in great gardens.